Hello, my precious students, and welcome to New Obsidian Dual Academy. I am the headmistress, Lady Sarisa. Today I wish to discuss a formula that can hopefully help you with your building of your side deck. Please note that this is not the only way to make a side deck. It is just a formula that I use when I deck build or plan on using against specific meta decks. Starting off, I usually take into account on the amount of combo heavy field swarming decks that exist, in which case I usually almost always side 1 to 2 copies of Nibiru. I personally usually only put in 1 because the decks I build usually have a higher chance to brick of running 2. If you are running a deck that utilizes Nibiru a bit better, prime example Invoked, Adamantipator, and any level 10 spam deck, then you could probably get away with putting Nib into the main deck or running 2 to 3 into the side deck. Most decks utilize specific hand traps due to synergy and availability in format. This can sometimes be the easiest or hardest to decide on. If you're running a very combo heavy deck like Speed Raise or Flower Guardian, then you're likely to run your hand traps into the side deck, like Ash Blossom or Infinite Impermanence. If you're running a not-so-combo-oriented deck, like Wind Witch Invoked or Kashteria, then hand traps sided are going to be a tad bit more situational, such as Artifact Scythe or Dimension Shifter. However, spell and trap removal is always ideal to have. You'll never know when you're going to run into a back row heavy deck or a deck reliant on a specific card. Depending on your deck, Cosmic Cyclone and Twin Twisters are both valid options. Twin Twisters is great if your deck relies on graveyard effects, while Cosmic Cyclone is great for removing problematic spell and trap cards from the game. The same can be said while dealing with an already established board. If you know you're going second, cards like Dark Ruler No More and Forbidden Droplet are excellent choices. You usually run 3 of one or the other. However, it can sometimes be better to run evenly matched instead, or with one of the other 2. It can also be rather difficult to properly fill up the side deck as a whole. There's going to be space left over after some of the pretty obvious choices. This is where we end up looking into the changing of the meta to see what cards hurt the top contending decks. For example, Kashtiria's meta during the making of this video. And cards that can hurt it is Artifact Scythe, Ash Blossom, Infinite Impermanence, and Evenly Matched. You can also prepare for decks most likely to be at your locals. For example, Adventure and Sword Soul are both super weak to Token Collector. You can also build your side deck with cards to counter cards that are inherently harm your deck. For example, Called by the Grave to deal with monster hand traps like Ash Blossom, Drone Lockbird, or Dimension Shifter. Here's a sample of what I usually use in most general side decks. I say example or sample, but let's go ahead and build it with a little bit of discussion of how I was explaining before. As I mentioned, Nibiru is a great option for swarming decks. They build up their board, and before they make their fully established board, you nib them. So in this, for the sake of this example, we're going to run 2. As I mentioned before, I usually only run 1, but 2 is still a great option. And for my sake, I usually run decks that already have hand traps like Ash Blossom or Infinite Impermanence. So we'll go ahead and run Artifact Scythe. I mean, not Scythe, sorry. Artifact Lancia at 3. And as I mentioned before, they're always going to be, I'd say always, but there is a high possibility where you're going to have to deal with some back row heavy or some problematic cards you don't want to deal with. So Cosmic Cyclone is what I usually go to. However, I just don't run 2 Cosmic Cyclones or 3 Cosmic Cyclones. I just run the 2 Cosmic Cyclones with a Harpies Feather Duster. But I also will like to point out as an honorable mention, even though I personally do not like this card, and that would be Lightning Storm. You can run 3 copies of this because, again, it can destroy all your opponent's attack position monsters, which also works to the effect of already established boards as well. However, I don't like this card because it also requires you to have no face-up cards. So running 3 can sometimes hurt you, and running 2 is like the sweet spot, usually, from what I hear, dealing with this card. I just don't run it. So we're just going to leave that there for as an honorable mention. And then, as I mentioned before, if you're dealing with already established boards, I like to use Dark Ruler No More, and if I'm using card decks that are graveyard reliant, I will use Forbidden Droplet instead. Now, I almost always use a playset of Dark Ruler No More, but I do like running Evenly Matched alongside it, depending on what decks I'm playing against, because some decks really get hurt by Evenly Matched. And so we're going to use Casteria as the example. I run a playset of Evenly Matched and call it good. And because I still play against Sword Soul quite a bit in the making of this video, I do run Token Collector at 1. Called by the Grave is almost always in my main deck, so let's pretend this was right there anyways. But usually, for the sake of simplicity, this is what my side decks have a tendency to look like. They're not always going to be exactly like this because certain things will be different, i.e. the types of hand traps. Sometimes I'll have the 1 Nibiru and I'll have the Call by the Grave in there, or I'll actually have Ash Blossom in here instead. Or I won't even have Evenly Matched, I'll have Dimensional Barrier. So just something to keep in mind for when you're deck building. Always remember that your side deck is the one thing that will change the most. Hopefully this little lesson helps you out in the future of deck building. And again, this is only a formula that I personally use when I build a side deck. And always remember, Storm Hate, Hand Trap, Spell and Trap Removal, Established Board Defense, and cards that naturally hurt the common decks of a format, or that can hurt, or use cards that can affect the cards that would hurt you. Hope this helps on your next deck build. Class dismissed.